Summary of The Couple Next Door, a novel written by Shari Lapena. Chapter 1. And found herself engulfed in a whirlwind of emotions as she navigated the complexities of a dinner party hosted by her neighbors, Cynthia and Graham. The evening began innocuously enough, with Anne's initial anticipation tempered by a sense of unease that lingered just beneath the surface. As she stepped into Cynthia and Graham's impeccably decorated home, Anne couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place, a sentiment exacerbated by Cynthia's effusive greeting and Marco's warm but distracted demeanor. As the evening progressed, Anne's unease escalated into a full-blown sense of discomfort, fueled in large part by Cynthia's unabashed flirtation with Marco. And watched with a sinking feeling as Cynthia leaned in a little too close, her clingy top leaving little to the imagination as she refilled Marco's glass with practiced ease. Despite her efforts to maintain a facade of composure, Anne felt a surge of resentment bubbling within her, a mix of anger and helplessness at the sight of her husband being openly courted by another woman. Caught in a vortex of conflicting emotions, Anne struggled to make sense of her own reactions. Part of her wanted to confront Cynthia, to demand an explanation for her brazen behavior. Yet, another part of her hesitated, fearful of causing a scene and drawing unwanted attention to herself. Trapped in a web of social niceties and unspoken expectations, Anne found herself immobilized, unable to break free from the suffocating grip of propriety. As the evening wore on, Anne's discomfort only intensified, exacerbated by her growing sense of insecurity and self-doubt. Surrounded by the opulence of Cynthia and Graham's home, Anne couldn't help but feel acutely aware of her own shortcomings, both real and perceived. Struggling to reconcile her own sense of identity with the idealized image of womanhood embodied by Cynthia, Anne found herself grappling with feelings of inadequacy and inferiority. Caught between the conflicting pressures of societal expectations and personal insecurities, Anne found herself adrift in a sea of uncertainty, unsure of where she belonged or how to assert herself in the face of adversity. Desperate for reassurance, she turned to Marco, seeking solace in his familiar presence and the promise of his unwavering love. Yet, even as Marco offered words of encouragement and gestures of affection, Anne couldn't shake the nagging sense of doubt that gnawed at her from within. As the evening wore on, Anne's anxieties only seemed to multiply, fueled by a potent combination of alcohol and self-doubt. With each passing moment, she felt herself slipping further and further away from the person she once was, consumed by a sense of inadequacy and despair. Surrounded by the laughter and chatter of her fellow guests, Anne felt more alone than ever, a solitary figure adrift in a sea of social expectation and unspoken resentment. Caught in a downward spiral of negative thoughts and emotions, Anne found herself increasingly fixated on the perceived injustices of her situation. From Cynthia's overt flirtation to Marco's apparent indifference, every slight and perceived slight only served to deepen Anne's sense of resentment and isolation. Struggling to maintain a facade of composure, she retreated into herself, withdrawing from the festivities unfolding around her as she grappled with the harsh realities of her circumstances. Amidst the chaos and confusion of the evening, Anne found herself grappling with the weight of her own expectations and the demands of motherhood. As the mother of a 6-month-old daughter, Kora, Anne felt a profound sense of responsibility weighing heavily on her shoulders, compounded by the absence of her child and the uncertainty of her well-being. With each passing moment, Anne's maternal instinct screamed out in protest, urging her to abandon the pretense of social niceties and prioritize the needs of her child above all else. Yet, even as Anne's instinct screamed out in protest, she found herself torn between competing obligations and conflicting desires. On the one hand, there was the societal pressure to conform to the expectations of her peers and participate in the evening's festivities. On the other hand, there was the maternal instinct to protect and nurture her child, a primal urge that threatened to overwhelm her at every turn. Caught in a web of competing desires and conflicting obligations, Anne found herself paralyzed by indecision, unsure of how to reconcile the demands of motherhood with the expectations of social propriety. Desperate for guidance, she turned to Marco, seeking reassurance in his familiar presence and the promise of his unwavering support. Yet, even as Marco offered words of encouragement and gestures of affection, Anne couldn't shake the nagging sense of doubt that gnawed at her from within. As the evening wore on, Anne's anxieties reached a fever pitch, exacerbated by the relentless onslaught of self-doubt and insecurity. Surrounded by the opulence of Cynthia and Graham's home, Anne couldn't help but feel like an imposter, a fraud masquerading as someone she was not. With each passing moment, she felt the weight of expectation bearing down on her, threatening to crush her beneath its suffocating embrace. Desperate for relief, Anne turned to the only source of solace she could find, the promise of escape. With each sip of wine, she felt herself drifting further and further away from the suffocating reality of her circumstances, lost in a haze of alcohol-induced euphoria. Yet, even as she sought refuge in the temporary oblivion of intoxication, Anne couldn't shake the nagging sense of guilt that gnawed at her from within. Caught in a vicious cycle of self-destructive behavior and emotional turmoil, Anne found herself teetering on the brink of despair, unsure of how to break free from the chains that bound her to her own insecurities and fears. With each passing moment, she felt herself slipping further and further away from the person she once was, consumed by a sense of hopelessness and despair. As the evening drew to a close, Anne found herself grappling with the harsh realities of her circumstances, confronted by the stark truth of her own vulnerability. With each passing moment, she felt the weight of expectation bearing down on her, threatening to crush her beneath its suffocating embrace. Yet, even as she struggled to find her footing in a world that seemed determined to keep her down, and refused to surrender to despair, clinging to the faint glimmer of hope that burned bright within her heart. In the end, it was this flickering flame of hope that guided Anne through the darkest of nights, leading her towards the dawn of a new day. With each step she took, she felt the weight of her burdens lifting, replaced by a sense of strength and resilience that she hadn't known she possessed. As she emerged from the shadows of her own despair, Anne found herself renewed, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead with courage, grace, and unwavering determination. Chapter 2. The disappearance of 6-month-old Kora Conti rattled the tranquility of her parents' lives like an earthquake tearing through a peaceful landscape. And Conti, her mother, experienced a primal scream reverberating in her head, echoing off the walls of her home as she stood frozen in front of the empty crib. Marco, her husband, fumbled with the light switch, his movements erratic, his mind grappling with the incomprehensible reality before him. Their baby, Kora, was gone, vanished from the crib where she should have been sleeping peacefully. Panic seized Anne's heart as she registered the absence of their child, while Marco stood paralyzed, his mind unable to accept the unthinkable. Anne's instinctive reaction was to call the police, her trembling fingers dialing 911 as she struggled to steady her breathing. Meanwhile, Marco remained motionless, trapped in a whirlwind of shock and guilt. The baby's room, once adorned with the innocence of childhood, now bore witness to Anne's distress, with vomit cascading over her trembling fingers onto the hardwood floor. The smell of bile mingled with the scent of panic, suffusing the room with an air of dread. Marco's paralysis persisted until Anne's accusing gaze pierced through his shock-induced stupor, igniting a flicker of movement within him. With Anne's command to call the police still echoing in his mind, Marco finally snapped out of his trance, his footsteps resounding with urgency as he raced around the house in a frantic search for any trace of their missing daughter. However, Anne's detached observation of Marco's actions betrayed a flicker of disbelief. Why was he checking rooms where their immobile infant couldn't possibly be? The logical corner of Anne's mind recognized the futility of Marco's search in those areas, a grim acknowledgement that someone had taken their baby. As Anne recounted the harrowing events to the emergency operator, her voice quivered with desperation. "Someone has taken our baby," she cried, her words a plea for help amidst the chaos engulfing their once peaceful home. The operator's reassurance was a fleeting lifeline in a sea of uncertainty, promising that help was on the way. Yet, even as Anne hung up the phone, her trembling body bore witness to the relentless grip of fear and despair. Marco's pallid visage appeared at the bedroom door, his guilt and anguish etched into the lines of his face. Anne's accusation hung heavy in the air as she lashed out, her scream a testament to the torment raging within her. The shattered mirror in the upstairs bathroom reflected the shattered remnants of their once idyllic life, a stark reminder of the irreversible damage inflicted by their tragedy. An air of unreality enveloped Anne as she sat on the sofa in the living room, a blanket draped around her trembling shoulders. Outside, police cars with flashing red lights punctuated the darkness, casting an eerie glow upon the pale walls of their home. The arrival of law enforcement transformed their once cozy abode into a grim crime scene, marking the beginning of a nightmare from which they could not awaken. Detective Rasbach, a composed figure in a well-cut dark suit, assumed command of the investigation with an air of authority that belied the gravity of the situation. His piercing blue eyes bore into Anne and Marco, demanding answers to the questions that loomed over them like a dark cloud. As Anne struggled to recount the events leading up to Kora's disappearance, her mind a whirlwind of fear and uncertainty, Marco's guilt-ridden gaze spoke volumes, a silent admission of his perceived failure as a father. The interrogation intensified as Detective Rasbach probed for details, unraveling the tangled web of their actions and decisions with surgical precision. Anne's guilt and self-doubt were laid bare, her mind haunted by the relentless chorus of what-ifs that tormented her in the wake of their tragedy. Meanwhile, Marco's attempts to shield Anne from further distress were futile, his own anguish bubbling to the surface with each passing moment. As Detective Rasbach delved deeper into the investigation, a sense of unease settled over Anne and Marco. The discovery of pills in their bathroom and the revelation of Marco's potential intoxication added fuel to the fire of suspicion that threatened to consume them. Yet, amidst the chaos and confusion, Detective Rasbach remained a steady presence, his unwavering focus on uncovering the truth a beacon of hope in their darkest hour. The investigation took a grim turn as Detective Rasbach uncovered inconsistencies in the Countess story, casting doubt on the veracity of their accounts. The malfunctioning motion detector and the unlocked back door raised red flags, hinting at the possibility of foul play. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Anne and Marco found themselves ensnared in a web of suspicion from which there seemed to be no escape. Their ongoing SHN desperation reached a fever pitch as Detective Rasbach zeroed in on the Countess' actions in the hours leading up to Kora's disappearance. Anne's guilt-ridden confession and Marco's faltering explanations only served to deepen the detective's suspicions, leaving them teetering on the brink of despair. Amidst the chaos and uncertainty, Anne and Marco clung to each other, their bond tested by the crucible of tragedy. As accusations flew and trust eroded, they found solace in their shared grief, a fragile lifeline in a sea of darkness. In the end, the truth remained elusive, shrouded in a veil of uncertainty that seemed impenetrable. Yet, amidst the darkness, a glimmer of hope remained, a flicker of light in the depths of despair. For Anne and Marco, the journey toward healing had only just begun, their path fraught with obstacles yet illuminated by the enduring power of love.